I've worn a uniform long enough to know that most problems don't announce themselves. They show up quietly, usually disguised as routine. Paperwork, meetings, conversations that sound friendly on the surface, but feel off if you know what to listen for. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 37 years old, a major in the Army National Guard, and I've spent most of my adult life in systems most people never notice unless something goes wrong. Logistics, oversight, compliance. The unglamorous parts of military service that keep operations legal, funded, and functional. It's not the kind of role that gets applause. It's the kind that keeps people out of trouble. Growing up, that difference mattered. My older sister, Vanessa, always filled a room. 4 years ahead of me, louder, sharper, quicker to speak. Teachers loved her. Adults remembered her name. At family gatherings, she told stories. I cleared plates. Nobody asked me about school. They asked Vanessa about her plans. When I joined the military, the reaction split cleanly down the middle. Some relatives said they were proud. Others looked confused, like I'd chosen a strange detour instead of the obvious road. Vanessa smiled the widest. She told everyone how brave I was, how disciplined, how she could never do something like that. She went into business. I went into uniform. It worked for a while. Over time, she built a career in civilian contracting, government-adjacent work, defense-adjacent money, the kind of companies that don't make weapons but move everything around them. Transport, storage, support services. She learned how to speak in metrics and milestones. I learned how to read between them. We stayed close enough to be polite. Holidays, group texts, the occasional call that lasted exactly long enough to prove we were still sisters. I didn't envy her success. I also didn't trust it. Not because I thought she was dishonest, but because I'd seen how easily rules bend when profit enters the conversation. I'd built my career around the assumption that good intentions don't survive deadlines. By the time I made major, I'd settled into a rhythm. My unit relied on me when something felt off, but no one wanted to put their name on it yet. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't political, I was consistent. That reputation kept me busy, and mostly invisible, which is how I preferred it. The assignment that changed everything came through, like most others, quietly. An internal notice, secondary audit support, multi-vendor logistics review, no urgency, no red flags, just another line item in a long list of responsibilities that never make headlines. I didn't know then that one of the vendors on that list was Redwood Strategic Services. I didn't know because at my level, you don't start with company names. You start with contract numbers, scopes of work, performance metrics. You work backward. That's intentional. It keeps personal bias out of the process. When I finally saw the name, it landed differently. Redwood Strategic Services wasn't a small firm. They handled regional support contracts across multiple states. I'd heard of them in passing. Never worked with them directly. Never had a reason to, until I realized who sat on their executive team. Vanessa didn't mention it when we spoke the week before. She asked about my schedule, my unit, whether I was traveling. I answered without thinking. It felt normal. In hindsight, that should have stood out. I flagged the potential conflict immediately, sent the notice up the chain, clear language, documented concern, standard procedure. The response came back faster than I expected. Acknowledged, noted, no change to assignment. The explanation was clean and technically correct. I wasn't involved in awarding the contract. I wasn't responsible for approvals or payments. I was reviewing technical compliance after the fact. Secondary oversight. No direct authority, no signature power. From a policy standpoint, it checked out. From a family standpoint, it felt wrong. I considered pushing back harder. I also knew how that would look. A senior officer requesting removal from an audit because of a family tie that didn't technically apply. It would raise more questions than it solved, so I stayed on the assignment. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I could remain objective. That was my first mistake. The early review didn't reveal anything dramatic. No missing equipment, no obvious fraud, nothing that would make anyone nervous. What I did see were patterns, small ones, the kind people explain away because they don't want to slow things down. Reports that looked polished but thin. Deliverables marked complete with supporting documentation that felt rushed. Timelines that worked on paper but didn't align cleanly when cross-checked. None of it was illegal by itself. None of it triggered automatic escalation. But together, it suggested a company comfortable operating right up against the edge of acceptable. I documented what I found, quietly, methodically, the way I'd been trained. Emails went out, clarifications requested, follow-ups noted. Responses came back friendly and vague, appreciative, non-committal. Vanessa called me that weekend. She didn't mention Redwood at first. She asked about work, about stress, about whether I was sleeping enough. It sounded like concern. It felt rehearsed. When she finally brought it up, she framed it as coincidence. Small world, funny how things overlap. I kept my answers neutral, professional. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain what I'd seen. I didn't need to. She reminded me gently that her company employed a lot of people, veterans, families, that delays in reviews could ripple outward in ways spreadsheets don't show. I reminded her just as gently that my job wasn't to manage outcomes. It was to verify process. The silence on the line stretched longer than usual. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. Still calm, less warm, she said she trusted me to be fair. I said that was the point. After the call ended, I sat where I was for longer than necessary. Not because I felt guilty, because I felt something else settling in. The recognition that this wasn't going to stay professional, no matter how carefully I handled it. The next set of documents arrived on a Monday morning. I opened them, took a breath, and started reading with the same discipline I always had, already aware that whatever I found next wouldn't stay confined to the folder on my screen. The cursor blinked at the top of the file, while the rest of the office stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists before people start arriving. I scrolled instead of thinking about the call from the night before, and let the numbers do the talking. Redwood's documentation was clean in the way polished things usually are. Formatting consistent. Language confident. Checklist complete. It was the kind of packet designed to move quickly through a review because it gave you no obvious reason to stop. That alone was reason enough to slow down. I started where I always did: timelines, delivery windows, verification dates, handoffs between subcontractors. When those line up, most other things tend to follow. When they don't, it's rarely an accident. The first mismatch was small. A storage inspection dated 2 days before the equipment it referenced had technically arrived. It wasn't impossible. It was just inconvenient. The note attached explained it away as a clerical error. Those happen. I flagged it and moved on. The second was harder to ignore. A compliance acknowledgement signed electronically at a time that didn't match the system log. Still not illegal, still explainable, still not something you want to see repeated. By mid-morning, I'd marked 4 items for clarification. Nothing escalatory, nothing dramatic, just questions. The responses came back faster than I expected. Too fast to be organic. Short answers, polite, vague. Each one closed with some version of, "Let us know if you need anything else which is corporate for please stop looking." I forwarded the thread to my internal folder and added notes. Dates, names, nothing personal, nothing emotional. The discipline mattered. If I treated this like family, I'd lose control of it. If I treated it like work, it stayed manageable. The base started to wake up around me. Doors opened, voices carried down the hall. Someone laughed at something that had nothing to do with me. I kept reading. Redwood wasn't the only vendor under review, but they were the only one where every answer seemed designed to move me along rather than inform me. Other companies asked questions back, requested clarification, pushed timelines. Redwood nodded and agreed. By lunch, I had enough to justify a deeper look. Not an investigation, just a secondary request for supporting documentation. The kind that doesn't raise alarms if there's nothing to hide. I sent it. The reply didn't come until late afternoon, and it didn't come from the address I expected. It came from a senior program manager with a title that suggested authority without specificity. The message was friendly, professional, and oddly personal. They appreciated my diligence. They understood the importance of military standards. They wanted to be good partners. Then came the sentence that didn't belong. They mentioned Vanessa, not by name, by role, by her commitment to transparency, by her respect for the mission. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a request. It was a reminder. Someone had connected the dots and wanted me to know it. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair. That was the moment the assignment stopped being abstract. Redwood wasn't just a name on a page anymore. It was my sister's voice repackaged in corporate language. I considered escalating then, not because policy demanded it, but because distance did. The longer I stayed embedded, the harder it would be to keep clean lines. Instead, I did what I always did. I documented, I requested, I waited. Vanessa called again that evening. This time she skipped the small talk. She said she'd heard I was thorough. She said some people found that intimidating. She said her team was doing their best under tight deadlines and external pressure. I told her deadlines don't change standards. She laughed lightly the way people do when they think you're being rigid for no reason. She reminded me that civilian contracting worked differently, that flexibility mattered, that the military needed partners who could adapt. I reminded her that adaptability didn't mean improvisation. She paused, then shifted. She asked if I trusted her. I said trust wasn't the issue. She said family should count for something. I said family didn't exempt anyone from review. The call ended without resolution. It didn't end badly, it ended carefully. The next morning, a meeting invite appeared on my calendar. Internal, informational, no agenda. It was framed as coordination. The attendee list included my direct supervisor and a civilian liaison I'd only met once. I accepted. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone of anything. They asked about workload, about timelines, about whether additional resources might help move the review along. I answered honestly. I said I needed complete documentation to close open questions. I said speed depended on clarity. They nodded. They thanked me. They ended the call. Nothing changed. What did change was the tone of incoming communication. Messages grew more formal. Response times slowed. Questions were answered with references to policy instead of specifics. That kind of shift doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when someone decides to manage perception instead of substance. I stayed late that night and ran cross-checks against previous Redwood contracts. Patterns repeated. Different regions, same phrasing, same shortcuts. Always just inside the lines. I added everything to the folder and labeled it by date. When I finally shut down my computer, the building was empty enough to echo. I walked past offices where lights had been left on for no reason and wondered how many decisions like this were made after hours when fewer people were watching. The weekend didn't bring relief. Vanessa sent a message that looked like concern and read like pressure. She said the review was becoming a distraction. She said leadership was asking questions. I didn't respond. On Monday, I learned what happens when someone else decides the pace. A formal complaint had been logged, not against Redwood, against me. The language was careful. It questioned my objectivity. It suggested my involvement was creating unnecessary delays. It framed my requests as excessive rather than required. It didn't mention family. It didn't mention Vanessa. It didn't have to. I read it twice and felt the familiar narrowing in my chest that comes when procedure turns personal. Not fear, focus. I opened my folder and added the complaint to the timeline. Then I drafted my response sentence by sentence, choosing accuracy over tone. Aware that from this point forward, every word I wrote would matter in ways it hadn't before. I didn't change my routine after reading the complaint. I didn't slam my laptop shut or pace the hallway. I stayed where I was and adjusted the margins on the response draft until the page looked the way it always did when I was about to send something that couldn't be taken back. The complaint didn't accuse me of misconduct. It didn't have to. It questioned judgment, objectivity, efficiency. In the military, those words carry weight without needing proof. They invite review. They slow careers quietly. I answered with dates. I listed each request I'd made when it was sent and why it was necessary. I attached the references. I avoided adjectives. I didn't mention family. I didn't mention pressure. I treated the complaint like a math problem and showed my work. Then I sent it and turned back to the files. If someone wanted to make this personal, the safest response was to make it boring. Boring is defensible. Boring survives scrutiny. I ran variance checks next. Storage temperatures, transport windows, inventory reconciliation. The kind of data people skim because it rarely surprises them. That's where the second layer showed up. Redwood's logs weren't wrong. They were rounded. Temperature ranges sat just inside acceptable thresholds with no spikes, no dips, no anomalies. That doesn't happen in real life. It happens in spreadsheets. Trucks break down, doors open, sensors drift. Perfect lines mean someone smoothed them. I pulled the raw feeds and compared them to the summaries. The differences were small. Minutes, fractions of degrees, but they were consistent, always corrected in the same direction, always toward compliance. I added another note to the folder. Next came training certifications. Dates lined up neatly until they didn't. A cluster of acknowledgements signed within minutes of each other across different locations. Possible, unlikely, The signatures matched. The timestamps didn't. I didn't accuse anyone of falsification. I flagged the pattern and requested clarification. The reply came the next day with a PDF attachment and a thank you for my patience. The explanation cited system batching, automated uploads, a technical quirk, plausible enough to satisfy someone who wanted to move on. I didn't move on. I checked the system logs. No batching event. No upload spike. Just manual entries spaced too evenly to be random. By midweek, the folder had grown thick enough to have weight. That mattered to me. Weight means context. Context is harder to dismiss. The messages from Redwood changed again. Where they'd once been friendly, they were now precise, legal, carefully worded. Every answer cited a clause or a section. No more casual assurances. Someone had looped in counsel. Vanessa stopped calling. That was new. When she finally reached out, it was by email, short, polished. She said she was disappointed that things had taken this turn. She said she hoped professionalism would prevail. She said she trusted me to handle this appropriately. The words were familiar. I'd seen them before, just not addressed to me. I didn't reply. Instead, I requested a site visit. Not an inspection. Not an audit. A routine verification. The kind that happens when paperwork starts to outpace reality. The request went through the proper channel. It landed with a thud. The response came back within an hour. Scheduling constraints, availability issues, weather concerns, all valid, all temporary. I adjusted the dates and sent it again. This time the answer took longer. When it came, it approved the visit with conditions. Limited access, observers present, time-boxed review. I accepted. The facility looked exactly like it was supposed to. Clean, organized, well-lit, signs in the right places. PPE available. People smiling in that practiced way that suggests they've been briefed. I watched instead of talking. Processes ran smoothly until they didn't. A pallet moved without scanning. A door propped open a little too long. A checklist initialed before the step was completed. Each time, someone corrected it quickly, almost automatically. Muscle memory can be trained. So can habits. I took notes. Not dramatic ones. Simple observations. Times, locations, names. At the end of the visit, the site manager asked if everything looked good. I said I'd review my notes. He nodded relieved and walked me to the exit. On the drive back, my phone rang. Vanessa, she asked how it went. I said it was productive. She asked if there were any issues. I said there were observations. She sighed, the sound exaggerated enough to be intentional. She said this was getting out of hand. She said leadership was unhappy. She said my name was coming up in conversations that didn't usually include officers at my level. I told her that wasn't my concern. She told me it should be. That was the first time she sounded angry. Back at my desk, I uploaded the site notes and attached photos. Nothing inflammatory. Nothing that would alarm someone skimming. Enough to support the patterns I'd already documented. I reviewed the complaint again and noticed what wasn't there. No reference to my findings. No attempt to refute them. Just an effort to reframe my role. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about fixing anything. It was about moving me. You don't argue facts you can't disprove. You remove the person asking the questions. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought clarity. If the goal was to sideline me, the next step would be administrative. Reassignment, review. Something that looked neutral on paper. I added a note to the folder and updated the timeline. Then I sent one more message through the protected channel attaching the full set of documents and requesting guidance on next steps. No accusations, no conclusions, just information organized and complete. The reply didn't come right away. In the meantime, the tone inside my unit shifted. Conversations stopped when I walked into a room. Meetings included fewer questions. Decisions were made without looping me in. That kind of isolation doesn't require orders. It spreads on its own. Late Friday afternoon, a calendar notification appeared for the following week. Internal review, mandatory attendance, no agenda. I saved my work, closed my laptop, and sat there for a moment longer than usual. Aware that the smallest irregularities had finally added up to something no one could pretend was routine anymore. I kept my phone face down during the meeting and watched the table instead. Wood grain, coffee rings, the edge where someone had chipped it and no one bothered to fix it. The room smelled like printer toner and burnt coffee, which usually meant decisions were about to be framed as necessary. No one mentioned the complaint directly. They never do. They talked about alignment. about expectations, about keeping things moving in a complex environment. The words were smooth practice and oddly empty. When it was my turn to speak, I stuck to facts. Status of the review, open items, pending clarifications. I didn't speculate, I didn't apologize. I answered the questions that were asked and ignored the ones that were implied. The civilian liaison nodded a lot. My supervisor avoided eye contact. After the meeting, I walked back to my office and closed the door. I didn't lock it. That would have looked defensive. I pulled up the shared drive and checked access logs, nothing unusual. Then I checked my email filters. 2 new rules I hadn't created. Both forwarded messages with certain keywords to a folder I didn't use. That was new. I deleted the rules and documented the change. Not because it was illegal, but because it told me someone else was paying attention to how information moved. Control doesn't start with orders, it starts with visibility. Vanessa called while I was writing it up. I let it ring once longer than necessary, then answered. She didn't ease into it this time. No small talk, no concern about my workload. She said my name the way people do when they're already annoyed. She told me the site visit had been unnecessary. She said my presence had made her team nervous. She said her board was asking why a guard major was digging into details that civilian auditors usually handled. I said the details were part of the contract. She said I was hiding behind policy. I said policy is the job. She laughed short and sharp. She said this wasn't how the real world worked. She said contracts live and die by relationships, not checklists. She said I was treating her company like an enemy. I told her I wasn't treating it like anything. I was reviewing it. She said family should have meant something. I said it did. It meant I was being more careful, not less. That's when her tone shifted again. Quieter, controlled. She told me I was putting myself in a bad position. She said people were starting to question whether I was the right fit for this role. She said maybe it would be better for everyone if I stepped aside. I told her that wasn't her decision. She didn't disagree. She just said decisions have a way of making themselves when enough people want the same outcome. After the call ended, I stayed where I was and stared at the wall long enough for the office sounds to fade. I didn't feel betrayed. Betrayal implies surprise. This felt more like confirmation. The next few days followed a pattern. Requests I sent took longer to come back. Meetings were scheduled without my input. When I asked questions, I got redirected. When I pushed, I was told to trust the process. Trust is what people ask for when they want you to stop checking. An updated org chart circulated on Thursday afternoon. My name hadn't moved, but my responsibilities had. Oversight redistributed, authority diluted, all temporary, according to the note attached. Temporary changes leave permanent footprints. I pulled the version history and saved it. Then I compared it to the complaint timeline. The alignment was tight enough to be intentional. That night, I opened my laptop at home and logged into the protected channel again. I added the org chart, the access log changes, the call notes from Vanessa. I didn't write conclusions. I let the sequence speak. I hesitated before sending it. Not because I doubted the facts, but because I knew what it would mean if someone higher up started connecting them. Escalation doesn't stop at one desk. It moves outward. It changes how people see you. I sent it anyway. The following Monday, Vanessa showed up at the base unannounced. She had clearance for meetings, not for wandering. She signed in, smiled at the front desk, and waited in the lobby like she belonged there. When I walked past, she stood. People noticed. She followed me down the hall without touching me. She asked if we could talk. I said we could talk in my office. She said she'd prefer somewhere neutral. I said the hallway was neutral enough. She lowered her voice and told me I was embarrassing her. She said this was spiraling. She said she was trying to protect both of us. She said my stubbornness was forcing her hand. I asked her what that meant. She said leadership needed confidence. She said if they didn't have it, they'd find someone who did. She said the review was becoming a distraction from the mission. I told her the mission includes compliance. She looked at me the way people do when they realize persuasion isn't working. Not angry, calculating. She said I should think about my future. She said guard careers are fragile. She said a few well-placed concerns could stall promotion for years. I told her she was crossing a line. She said lines are flexible. The conversation ended when a captain walked by and asked if everything was okay. Vanessa smiled and said we were just catching up. Family stuff. After she left, I closed my office door and sat down. My hands were steady. My breathing was normal. The reaction came later in the form of a dull pressure behind my eyes that told me I'd reached the part of this where intentions stop mattering. That afternoon, I received an email marked Administrative Coordination, no sender name in the preview, just a subject line that sounded harmless. Inside was a notice, preliminary review, scope to be determined, mandatory participation, no accusation, no explanation. I added it to the folder. I didn't feel cornered, I felt mapped. When pressure comes from multiple directions at once, it's because someone has taken the time to plan. I shut down my computer, gathered the physical notes I'd kept separate from the digital record, and placed them in my bag. Not because I expected them to be taken, because habits matter when things get quiet. As I walked out of the building, I passed the lobby desk and noticed a new stack of visitor badges behind the glass. Blank, ready. The base looked the same as it always did. Flags, fences, familiar routines moving forward without pause. I drove home with the windows down and the radio off, aware that the shift hadn't come from a single threat or a raised voice, but from a choice my sister had made to stop treating this like family and start treating it like leverage. I didn't open the notice right away. I let it sit in my inbox while I finished a checklist that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with muscle memory. Some habits exist so you don't have to think while the ground shifts. When I did open it, the language was careful enough to sound reasonable. Preliminary administrative review, scope pending, cooperation expected. It wasn't an accusation, it was a repositioning. The kind that moves you from contributor to subject without ever saying the word. I saved the document, named it with the date, and added it to the folder. By mid-morning, the ripple reached my desk. A meeting request from personnel. A request from legal for clarification on my role. A short note from my supervisor asking me to keep them informed. None of it hostile. All of it coordinated. The review wasn't about Redwood. Not officially, it was about me. The complaint itself followed later that afternoon, routed through the proper channel and written by someone who understood how to sound neutral while aiming sharp. It questioned my judgment, my objectivity, whether my continued involvement had created delays that impacted readiness. It suggested reassignment might be in the best interest of the mission. It didn't mention Vanessa. It didn't mention Redwood. It didn't mention facts. That omission was the tell. If you want to refute findings, you talk about data. If you want to remove a person, you talk about fit. I read it once, then again slower, noting the phrases that mattered. Perception of bias, operational friction, leadership confidence. These aren't violations, they're leverage. I drafted my response the same way I always did. Chronological, documented, sparse. I referenced my earlier disclosures. I attached the site notes. I listed the requests that had gone unanswered or partially answered. I avoided adjectives and let timestamps do the work. Before sending it, I read it as if I were the one trying to move me out of the way. That's when I caught the gap. The complaint assumed the review had stalled because of me. It didn't account for the fact that Redwood had delayed responses and restricted access. It didn't mention the conditions placed on the site visit. It treated those constraints as background noise instead of contributing factors. I added a paragraph and attached the emails. Then I sent it. The silence afterward wasn't relief. It was the pause you get when people regroup. In the days that followed, I noticed the small things first. My name removed from an agenda. A task reassigned without explanation. A meeting shortened when I joined. None of it rose to the level of retaliation. That's how you know it's intentional. I started keeping a parallel log, not of work, of behavior, dates. Who said what? Who stopped saying anything at all? Not to build a case, but to keep my own perception calibrated. Isolation has a way of distorting reality if you let it. Vanessa didn't call. She didn't need to. The system was doing what she wanted. Late Wednesday, I received a calendar invite for the following week. Mandatory, closed attendance, HR present. The title was generic enough to be meaningless. In my line of work, that usually means it isn't. I noted the time, 4:00 p.m. I didn't react. I updated the folder and continued working. By Thursday, word had spread. Not openly. Sideways. People avoided sitting next to me. Conversations shifted topics when I entered a room. One lieutenant I'd mentored for years nodded without smiling and kept walking. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed loyalty, but because it confirmed how quickly uncertainty becomes contagious. I got a call from personnel asking for copies of my evaluations. Not because there were issues, they said. Just for completeness. I sent them. My record was clean. That's what made the request uncomfortable. Clean records don't usually need assembling. That night I logged into the protected channel again and reviewed what I'd sent. It was all there, the disclosures, the timelines, the documentation, enough for anyone who wanted to see it. What I didn't know was whether anyone did. Friday morning my supervisor stopped by unannounced. He didn't sit, he didn't close the door. He said leadership was concerned about distractions. He said maybe it would be best if I took a step back until things settled. I asked what that meant. He said reassignment was being discussed. Temporary, administrative. No impact on rank or pay. I asked if there were any findings against me. He said no. I asked why the timing lined up with my review of Redwood. He said timing is complicated. I thanked him for the transparency and asked him to put the recommendation in writing. His jaw tightened. He said that wasn't necessary. I said it was. After he left, I pulled the printed notes from my bag and laid them out on the desk. Dates, calls, messages, the complaint, the calendar invite. The pattern was clear enough to see without emotion. I made copies and stored them off-site. Not because I expected anything dramatic, because redundancy is the only thing that outlasts pressure. Vanessa texted that afternoon, a single line, "We need to talk." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my calendar and reviewed the meeting details again. Same location, same attendees, same time. I backed up my files, logged out of my work accounts, and shut down my computer. Not as an exit, as a precaution. As I left the building, I passed the bulletin board near the elevator, where notices get posted for no one in particular. A new memo had gone up about professional conduct and maintaining trust within the command. I read it once and kept walking. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun had dropped low enough to throw long shadows across the asphalt. I sat in my car for a moment longer than usual, not because I felt uncertain, but because I understood what the complaint had really done. It hadn't challenged my work. It had changed my position. And once your position changes, the system doesn't need to prove you wrong. It just needs to decide you're inconvenient. I noticed the calendar invite at 10:23 in the morning, sandwiched between a logistics sync and a training reminder. The title was harmless. Administrative Review Meeting, no agenda, closed attendance, HR included. In the military, that combination doesn't need explanation. The time was 4:30 p.m. I stared at it long enough to register the feeling without reacting to it. Not shock, not panic, recognition. When you've been around long enough, you learn the shapes these things take before anyone says the quiet part out loud. I accepted the invite and went back to work. The day moved forward like it always did. Emails came in, phones rang. Someone asked me a question about a storage variance that had nothing to do with Redwood. I answered it. Someone else asked if I had a minute later. I said yes, and meant it. By noon, people knew. Not because anyone told them directly, but because meetings like that don't stay private. They leak through posture and tone, through the way conversations end early and start somewhere else. At lunch, I sat at my desk and ate from a container I didn't remember packing. My phone buzzed twice, once from Vanessa, once from a number I didn't recognize. I ignored both. I wasn't angry, I wasn't afraid. I was focused on making sure nothing about the next few hours was sloppy. At 1:30, I saved my work and backed it up to the off-site drive. I didn't wait for prompts or reminders. I followed the checklist I'd used for years whenever something felt unstable. Documents labeled, attachments verified, access logs exported. At 2:10, HR sent a reminder. Same room, same time, mandatory attendance. At 2:45, my supervisor stopped by again. This time, he closed the door. He said the meeting was procedural. He said it was about alignment and expectations. He said it wasn't personal. I asked if there were any findings against me. He said no. I asked if the complaint had been resolved. He said it was under consideration. I asked if Redwood had been mentioned. He didn't answer that one. When he left, I packed the personal items from my desk into my bag. Not everything, just the things that mattered. A notebook, a challenge coin from a deployment years ago, a photo I kept turned face down. Not because I was certain of anything, because I understand patterns. By 3:30, the building had shifted. Conversations dropped to whispers. People found reasons to be somewhere else. No one wanted to be near the room where decisions get finalized. I walked the hall once to clear my head and passed the lobby. The front desk was quiet. The badge printer sat idle behind the glass. The stack of blank visitor passes was still there. At 3:42, Vanessa called again. I answered this time. She didn't say hello. She said we didn't have to do this. She said she'd tried to protect me. She said leadership needed confidence and clarity, and I'd made that difficult. I asked her if she'd filed the complaint. She didn't deny it. She said it wasn't personal. She said it was necessary. She said my presence had become a liability for everyone involved. I told her she'd crossed more than one line. She told me lines depend on who draws them. The call ended without raised voices. That made it worse. At 3:50, I walked toward the conference room. The walk took 90 seconds. Long enough to notice how many doors were closed. Long enough to see people suddenly become very interested in their screens. The room was already set up. Bottled water, folders placed neatly in front of each chair. HR sat to one side. My supervisor sat across from where I would be. A civilian representative I didn't recognize sat at the end of the table, hands folded. No one smiled. I sat down and placed my bag at my feet. I didn't open the folder in front of me. I didn't need to. The HR representative cleared their throat and began reading from a script. They thanked me for my service. They acknowledged my contributions. They said the review process had raised concerns about fit and effectiveness in my current role. The words were measured, rehearsed, designed to sound reasonable when repeated later. They said the command had decided to pursue reassignment effective immediately, temporary, administrative, no disciplinary action implied. I asked if this decision was related to my review of Redwood Strategic Services. There was a pause, not long, just long enough to register. The civilian rep said the decision was about maintaining trust and momentum. I asked if any of my findings had been disputed. They said that wasn't the scope of the meeting. I asked if the complaint had been substantiated. HR said the process was ongoing. I asked if removing me from the role while the process was ongoing could be considered retaliatory. That word landed heavier than the others. The room went still. The civilian rep shifted in their chair. HR looked at my supervisor. My supervisor looked down at the table. They told me I could submit additional documentation if I wished. I told them I already had. The HR rep said they'd need my badge after the meeting. I looked at the clock on the wall. 3:58 p.m. I nodded once and sat back in my chair, aware that the mechanics were almost complete. Not because I agreed with them, but because I understood what they thought they were doing. At 4:00 p.m., the HR rep slid a form across the table and asked me to sign acknowledgement of reassignment. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I asked for a copy of the documentation supporting the decision. They said it would be provided later. I said later wasn't acceptable. The civilian rep opened their mouth to respond, then stopped. The sound from the hallway cut through the room, mechanical, familiar. The badge printer in the lobby started running. It cycled once, paused, then ran again. No one at the table spoke. The HR rep looked toward the door. My supervisor frowned confused. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't say anything. I just listened as the printer ran a third time, each pass louder than the last, aware that whatever my sister thought she'd scheduled for 4:30 p.m. was no longer the only thing on the calendar. The printer sound didn't belong to the room we were in. That was the first thing that registered. It was too mechanical, too public, and it carried down the hallway in a way private decisions never do. No one spoke. The HR representative glanced at the door again, then at the form still sitting in front of me. The civilian rep shifted, then settled as if posture could restore order. The printer ran once more. I stood without asking permission and opened the conference room door. The hallway looked the same as it had 10 minutes earlier, except for the movement near the lobby. 3 people stood at the desk. 2 in dark suits, 1 in uniform. All 3 had visitor badges hanging straight, freshly printed edges still warm enough to curl. The receptionist's voice carried low and tight. "They're asking for you." I didn't correct her. I walked. As I approached, the woman in uniform turned first. Mid-40s, hair pulled back clean. No insignia beyond what was necessary. She didn't smile. She didn't rush. "Major Claire Morgan," she asked. "Yes." She held out credentials without breaking eye contact. "Department of Defense Inspector General." The name didn't matter. The seal did. The posture did. "We need to speak with you," she said. "Now." Behind me, footsteps picked up. The HR rep had left the room. The civilian rep followed. My supervisor arrived last, trying to look like he knew what was happening. The IG agent didn't acknowledge them. "We're conducting an unscheduled inquiry related to protected disclosures and potential retaliatory actions," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Any personnel decisions involving Major Morgan are to be paused immediately. The word paused landed differently than cancelled. Paused implies authority. My supervisor opened his mouth. The agent raised a hand. This is not a request, she said. We'll need a private space. I pointed down the hall. Conference room 3, second door on the left. She nodded once and started walking. The 2 investigators followed. No hesitation, no waiting for permission. Inside the room, the air felt denser. The agent took the head of the table. One investigator sat to her right, the other to her left. I sat where I'd been before, the folder still untouched. Before we begin, she said, I want to be clear. You are not the subject of this inquiry. I didn't nod. I didn't speak. I let her continue. We received documentation through a protected channel indicating possible irregularities in contract oversight and subsequent administrative actions that could constitute retaliation. She slid a thin packet across the table. The top page had my name on it, my submission, dates I recognized, attachments I'd labeled carefully. When did you submit this? She asked. I gave the date. Did anyone instruct you to submit it? No. Did anyone discourage you? I thought of Vanessa in the hallway. The access rules, the complaint language. Yes, I said, indirectly. The investigator on her left made a note. Were you aware that a personnel action was scheduled for today? She asked. Yes. At what time? 4 o'clock. She checked her watch. And when were you notified this morning? She looked up. Did the individuals involved in that decision have access to your disclosure? I answered carefully. I don't know who accessed it. But the behavior changed immediately after submission. She nodded. That aligns with what we're seeing. There was a knock at the door. The HR rep stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. We weren't notified of any inspection today, they said. The IG agent turned just enough to meet their eyes. Inspections under our authority don't require notification. We're here to preserve records and prevent interference. The HR rep's face tightened. We were in the middle of a meeting. You were in the middle of a personnel action, the agent said, which is now suspended. She turned back to me. Do you have access to your documentation? She asked. Yes. Can you provide it now? I opened my laptop and connected to the secure drive. I didn't explain what I was pulling up. The files were labeled clearly enough to speak for themselves. Emails, logs, site notes, the complaint, the calendar invite, the access changes, each one time-stamped, each one placed in order. The investigator on the right leaned forward. Did your family member have involvement in the vendor under review? Yes, I said. She's an executive at Redwood Strategic Services. The agent's expression didn't change, but the room did. The kind of shift that happens when a theory becomes a line of inquiry. Did she communicate with you about the review? She asked. Yes. Did she attempt to influence your actions? Yes. Did she initiate or contribute to the complaint against you? I believe so. The agent closed the folder and sat back. Thank you, she said. That's sufficient for now. She stood and opened the door. In the hallway, more people had gathered, not close enough to hear, close enough realizing something had broken routine. She addressed them without raising her voice. Effective immediately, she said, any administrative action involving Major Morgan is suspended. All relevant records are to be preserved. No deletions, no edits, no access restrictions. She turned to me. You'll remain in your current position pending review. If anyone attempts to alter that, notify us directly. She handed me a card, a name, a number, direct line. I took it and put it in my pocket. As the investigators moved past the group toward the next office, I stayed where I was. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood the difference between motion and control. My supervisor stood near the wall, hands at his sides, saying nothing. The HR rep stared at the table like it might offer guidance. The building resumed its sounds slowly, phones ringing, doors opening, conversations restarting with careful spacing. I closed my laptop and stood. The meeting at 4 o'clock no longer existed, but the consequences of scheduling it were already moving through the system. Quiet and irreversible, carried forward by a sound that had no place in a firing meeting and didn't ask permission before it arrived. The hallway didn't empty when the investigators moved on. It thinned the way crowds do when curiosity gives way to caution. People drifted back to their offices with the careful speed of professionals who know when not to ask questions. I returned to my desk and sat without opening my computer. The card in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, not because of what it promised, but because of what it made unnecessary. From that moment on, explanations were optional, documentation wasn't. At 4:12, an email landed from HR, short, formal. The meeting scheduled for that afternoon had been postponed indefinitely. No apology, no explanation, just a directive to disregard the earlier memory. I archived it and added it to the folder. At 4:18, my supervisor sent a message asking if I had a moment. I replied that I was available. He didn't come by. He didn't call. Availability is relative when power changes hands. I logged in and opened the shared drive. Access permissions had been restored across the board. The filters that had quietly redirected messages earlier were gone. Someone somewhere had been told to undo things quickly. I didn't take satisfaction in that. I took note. The investigators worked the building the way water moves through cracks. Quiet, persistent. Offices that hadn't seen visitors in months suddenly had doors closed. A captain I'd only ever exchanged pleasantries with was escorted down the hall carrying a stack of folders he hadn't had that morning. At 4:47, I saw Vanessa's name pop up on my phone. I let it ring. At 4:53, she texted. One line. What did you do? I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because answering would have implied agency I didn't need to claim. I hadn't done anything. I documented. At 5:10, a lieutenant from another section stopped by my desk. He looked like he wanted to say something supportive and didn't know how. He settled for asking if I needed anything. I said no. He nodded relieved and left. By the time I shut down my computer, the investigators were still working. Conference room doors stayed closed. Voices stayed low. The building felt different, not louder or quieter, but more deliberate. Decisions were being weighed instead of assumed. As I walked toward the exit, I passed the lobby again. The badge printer sat still now, its work finished for the moment. The receptionist looked up and met my eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't avoid me either. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been that morning. I stood by my car and checked my phone. A voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. The area code told me enough. I listened. This is Special Agent Hoffman with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. I wanted to confirm receipt of the contact information I provided earlier. We may need to follow up. Please keep your phone on. I saved the number and deleted the voicemail. At home, I didn't celebrate. I reheated leftovers and ate standing at the counter. The house felt unchanged. That mattered. Victories that require rearranging your life usually aren't victories at all. Vanessa called again while I was rinsing a plate. I answered this time. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She asked what was happening. I told her investigators had arrived. I told her they were looking into the complaint and the contract review. She said that wasn't necessary. She said this had gotten out of hand. She said she was trying to protect her company. I told her protecting a company doesn't involve silencing reviewers. She said I should have come to her. I said I had. She paused. Then she asked if this meant she was in trouble. I said I didn't know. That was the truth. The call ended without closure. It didn't need it. The next morning, the parking lot was half full. Sick calls, remote work requests, the usual responses when uncertainty enters an organization. People don't panic. They minimize exposure. Inside, the investigators had set up in the larger conference room. Boxes of files lined the wall, laptops open, cables everywhere. This wasn't a courtesy visit. This was work. At 9:30, HR circulated a memo about cooperation with federal inquiries. Mandatory, non-negotiable. It used the word retaliation 3 times. That word does more than accuse. It warns. I received a meeting request from legal at 10:05. Clarification only, no decisions. I attended and answered questions about process, not people. I gave dates, not opinions. They thanked me and ended the call quickly. At 11:20, my supervisor finally came by. He looked tired, older than he had 2 days earlier. He said leadership wanted to reassure me that my position was secure. I asked what had changed. He said circumstances. I nodded and returned to my screen. By midday, the building had settled into a new rhythm. People spoke more carefully. Emails included more recipients. Decisions were documented instead of assumed. I focused on my work. The Redwood file remained open. The questions unanswered stayed unanswered. At 1:45, I received a request from the IG office for additional documentation. Specific items, clear scope. I sent them within minutes. At 2:30, a message came through from finance. Redwood's payments had been flagged for review, temporarily, procedural. At 3:00, Vanessa texted again. They're asking questions. I put my phone face down. The day didn't end with an announcement or a confrontation. It ended with the steady accumulation of consequences. Access revoked here. Authority questioned there. Small shifts that add up. As I packed up to leave, I noticed the calendar invite for the next day had changed. The same meeting title, different attendees, no HR. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. What mattered was that 5 minutes had been enough. Enough for the balance to tip. Enough for a private decision to become a public process. Not because someone intervened dramatically, but because the system recognized itself in the paperwork I'd already placed on the table and decided to do what it does best when forced to look closely. I didn't announce when I sent the next batch of files. I never do. Announcements turn work into theater, and theater invites opinions. Evidence doesn't need applause. The request from the IG office was narrow and specific. Raw logs, system access histories, copies of emails exactly as received, not forwarded, not summarized. They weren't asking what I thought. They were asking what existed. I gave them what they asked for the same way I'd done everything else. Clean folders, clear file names, no commentary. By mid-morning, the building had developed a new habit. People checked their inbox before speaking. Doors closed more often. Conversations ended with "put it in writing," which is the organizational equivalent of clearing your throat before a difficult sentence. At 10:40, a contractor I'd never met before was escorted past my office, carrying a laptop bag that looked heavier than it should have been. At 10:52, finance sent a notice that certain payments were under review, pending verification. The word routine appeared 3 times. That was generous. I focused on the work that remained mine. Oversight doesn't stop because attention arrives. If anything, it tightens. The IG agent I'd met the day before stopped by without knocking. She didn't sit. She asked if I had 10 minutes. I said yes. She asked me to walk her through my process. Not what I'd found, but how I looked, where I started, what triggered deeper review, how I decided when to request more documentation instead of escalating. I explained the way I always do. Timelines first, variants second, patterns last. I told her I avoid conclusions until patterns repeat across sources. I told her I document everything because memory gets unreliable under pressure. She nodded once. That's consistent with what we're seeing, she said. She didn't say from whom. She didn't need to. She asked about my interactions with Redwood's leadership. I stuck to dates and quotes. I didn't describe tone. Tone disappears on paper. She asked about my sister. I paused long enough to choose the right answer. She's persuasive, I said. And she understands process. That's why this didn't show up as a single violation. The agent wrote that down. When she left, I noticed 2 things. 1, she hadn't asked me to speculate about intent. 2, she hadn't asked me to justify my decisions. Those are questions people ask when they're unsure where the weight falls. At lunch, I didn't eat with anyone. Not because I was avoiding people, but because no one invited me. That's how distance forms. Quietly, without instruction. A text came through from Vanessa while I was scrolling through a reconciliation report. They want emails. I didn't reply. 10 minutes later, another text. They're asking about you. Still no reply. I wasn't withholding information. I was withholding interference. There's a difference. By early afternoon, the IG office requested an interview with me the following morning. Voluntary, recorded, standard language. I accepted and blocked the time. The interview wasn't a confrontation. It was an inventory. They moved through the timeline the way I had, checking each step against what others had said. When answers aligned, they moved on. When they didn't, they circled back. At one point, the agent slid a printed email across the table. It wasn't mine. It was from Redwood. Internal, executive level. The subject line referenced mitigation strategy. The body didn't mention me by name. It didn't have to. It discussed repositioning the review function and reducing friction through administrative channels. It mentioned a known relationship that could be managed. I read it once and pushed it back. Is this authentic? The agent asked. Yes, I said. That's her language. She asked if I recognized the timestamp. I did. It was sent less than an hour after my protected disclosure. That's when the room shifted. They didn't raise voices. They didn't ask sharper questions. They simply adjusted the order of things. What had been context became focus. What had been incidental became relevant. The interview ended without ceremony. They thanked me for my time. They reminded me not to discuss the content with anyone else. I didn't need the reminder. Back at my desk, I noticed my inbox had changed again. More messages CC'd to legal, more approvals required, less casual decision-making. Evidence does that. It rearranges the room without asking permission. At 3:15, HR sent an update. Leadership had decided to hold all personnel actions related to ongoing reviews. The language was broad enough to be protective. The timing wasn't subtle. I forwarded it to the IG office and added it to the folder. Vanessa called at 4:02. I answered because avoidance had served its purpose. She sounded different, less certain. She said the investigators had copies of emails she thought were internal. She said this was becoming dangerous. I told her the emails were part of the record. She asked if I'd given them. I said I'd given them everything I had. She accused me of trying to destroy her. I told her I wasn't trying to do anything. I was doing my job. She said families don't do this to each other. I said families don't file complaints to remove reviewers. Silence followed. The kind that stretches not because there's nothing to say, but because the options have narrowed. She said I could still fix this. She said I could clarify intent. She said misunderstandings happen. I said intent doesn't change timestamps. The call ended without resolution. By the end of the day, the pattern was undeniable. Every attempt to reframe the issue collapsed under sequence. Every explanation weakened when placed next to another. The truth didn't need reinforcement. It just needed room. As I shut down my computer, I noticed a new meeting on my calendar for the following week. No HR, no civilian reps, just command and legal. I didn't open the details. I didn't need to. The system had moved past persuasion and into accounting, and once it reaches that phase, relationships stop carrying weight. Evidence doesn't care who you're related to. It doesn't respond to pressure. It doesn't remember favors. It just sits there patient and complete, waiting for someone to read it in the order it was written. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in increments spaced just far enough apart to feel orderly. That's how institutions absorb shock, by breaking it into memos. The first change was procedural. Redwood's access to certain systems was limited pending verification. The word temporary showed up again, doing its usual work of calming people who don't want to think too hard about what happens next. The second change was financial. A payment schedule shifted. Nothing dramatic, no headlines. Just a note from finance asking for confirmation before release. Confirmation takes time. Time changes leverage. The third change was personal. Vanessa stopped calling, not dramatically, no final message, no angry voicemail. The line just went quiet, the way relationships do when they've run out of useful angles. Silence can be strategic. It can also be exhausted. Inside the building, people adjusted without commentary. A contractor I'd seen daily started using a different hallway. A colonel who used to greet me by name began addressing me by rank and last name only. Formality returned where familiarity had been. That didn't bother me. What bothered me was the absence of noise. No outrage, no public reckoning, just a slow tightening around the edges. I received a request from legal for a sworn statement, standard, voluntary. I scheduled it and prepared the same way I always do. Facts first, sequence second, opinions last. The statement took 90 minutes. They asked me to confirm dates, recipients, methods of transmission. They asked me whether I'd received any assurances or threats. They asked me whether I believed the complaint against me had merit. I answered carefully and completely. When they asked if I regretted how I'd handled the review, I said no. Regret is for mistakes. Documentation isn't one. When the statement ended, the attorney thanked me and said nothing else. That was fine. Closure is overrated. The next visible shift came from command. A message went out reminding everyone of obligations related to protected disclosures. It cited policy, it cited law, it didn't cite names. Names aren't necessary when patterns are clear. By midweek, Redwood's presence on the base had thinned. Fewer vehicles, fewer badges, fewer friendly waves from people who used to linger. Contractors don't vanish overnight. They fade one access point at a time. At home, my phone stayed quiet. Group chats went dormant. Family updates traveled through other people and arrived filtered. I learned about a birthday after it passed. I learned about a dinner I hadn't been invited to. I didn't ask why. The absence of apology was louder than anything Vanessa could have said. Not because I expected remorse, but because silence confirmed the choice she'd made. When persuasion fails, people either pivot or retreat. She retreated. A meeting with command and legal replaced the one that had once included HR. Different room, different seating, no water bottles, no scripts. They told me the review had expanded. They told me I was not under investigation. They told me my role would continue with added oversight support. They framed it as confidence. I asked what that meant for Redwood. They said decisions would be made after completion of the inquiry. I asked if my position was secure. They said yes. I nodded and asked nothing else. Security isn't comfort. It's just space to keep working. The days that followed felt longer not because of stress, but because attention slows everything down. Emails were drafted, reviewed, redrafted. Meetings ran over by minutes that added up to hours. People checked with legal before speaking. That kind of environment exposes habits. Some people thrive, others struggle. I noticed who stopped emailing me altogether and who quietly added me to threads I'd been left off before. I noticed which supervisors began documenting conversations that used to happen in hallways. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. Late one afternoon, an email arrived from finance. Redwood's contract was being partially suspended pending findings. Specific language, narrow scope, but suspension nonetheless. I forwarded it to the IG office and closed the loop. That night, Vanessa texted for the first time in days. One sentence. I didn't think it would go this far. I read it once and set the phone down. The next morning, I saw her name on the visitor log when I walked past the lobby. She didn't look up. She didn't approach me. She sat with her hands folded, posture straight, waiting for someone else. We didn't speak. The investigators escorted her past my office later that day. She didn't look at me then either. I didn't need her to. The space between us had already been filled with documents. By the end of the week, the tone had settled into something sustainable, not calm, just managed. The kind of quiet that comes after people accept that outcomes are no longer negotiable. I finished a report that afternoon and sent it off without fanfare. When I stood to leave, my supervisor caught my eye and gave a small nod. Not approval, acknowledgement. That was enough. At home, I cooked a simple dinner and ate it at the table. I didn't check my phone until afterward. No new messages, no missed calls. I washed the dishes and dried them immediately instead of leaving them in the rack. Some habits ground you. Others remind you that control is situational. The fallout continued to spread beyond my view, but my part in it narrowed. I did the work I'd always done, only now it traveled further without me pushing it. Family silence settled into something permanent, or at least durable. I stopped expecting it to break. Expectations create disappointment. Documentation creates outcomes. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I thought briefly about the meeting that had once been scheduled for 4 o'clock and how small it looked now, reduced to a timestamp in a folder full of better facts. There were no apologies waiting, no reconciliations forming in the dark, just the steady, unglamorous consequences of choosing leverage over honesty, unfolding at a pace that didn't require my supervision anymore. I didn't wake up feeling victorious. The morning after the last interviews, my alarm went off at the same time it always did, and I moved through the routine without thinking about what had already been decided, somewhere above my pay grade. Uniform on, coffee black, keys in the same place. That's how you know something is finished, not when it's announced, but when it stops altering your behavior. At work, the building felt settled. Not relaxed, but stabilized. The investigators were still around, though fewer than before. Their presence had become background noise, like construction you get used to after a while. Necessary, temporary, not your problem unless you make it one. My inbox reflected the shift. Fewer questions about me, more questions about systems. Oversight doesn't end with accountability. It usually expands. I answered what was mine to answer and forwarded the rest. Command didn't call a meeting to close anything out. They rarely do. Closures imply emotion. Institutions prefer continuity. What they did do was adjust my role. Nothing dramatic, no announcement. A memo updating reporting lines, expanded authority over secondary reviews. Direct access to legal on certain matters. The explanation was simple: experience. Experience is a polite word for trust that's been tested. I accepted the changes and went back to work. Redwood's name stopped appearing in my inbox after a while. When it did, it was in a different context. Compliance updates, legal notifications, Final determinations routed through channels that didn't require my response. I didn't ask for updates. I didn't need them. The outcome had moved beyond personal stakes. Once that happens, curiosity loses its edge. Vanessa never apologized. That didn't surprise me. Apologies require acknowledgement of intent. And intent was the one thing she'd avoided owning from the beginning. Silence was consistent. It fit the pattern. I heard about her situation indirectly, through legal language, through third parties who chose their words carefully. No one said investigation out loud unless they had to. No one said charges. They said exposure. They said liability. They said ongoing. At home, the quiet settled into something manageable. Family gatherings continued without me, or maybe they didn't. I stopped checking. When someone wanted to talk, they reached out. When they didn't, I let it stand. One evening, weeks later, I found a message waiting on my phone. A number I recognized but hadn't seen in a while. Vanessa. The message was short, no greeting, no context. Just a sentence that sounded rehearsed. You were right about the process. I stared at it longer than I should have. Not because I needed validation, but because I wanted to understand what she was actually saying. Process is a safe word. It acknowledges outcome without conceding motive. I didn't respond. Deleting it felt unnecessary. Keeping it felt pointless. I archived it and moved on. At work, the changes became routine. People asked me for input earlier in conversations. Documentation requests came with more detail. Decisions were framed with awareness instead of confidence alone. That's what quiet justice looks like, not punishment. Correction. I was asked to brief a group of junior officers on compliance reviews a month later. Not a speech, a walkthrough. How to recognize patterns. How to protect yourself without escalating prematurely. How to document in ways that survive pressure. I told them the truth, that most problems don't look dangerous until someone gets impatient. That pressure rarely announces itself as pressure. That if you do your job correctly, you might still be blamed for slowing things down. I told them documentation isn't armor, it's memory. One of them asked if it was worth it. I said it depends on what you think your job is. The base continued operating. Contracts rotated. People transferred. New issues replaced old ones. That's how systems stay alive, by never pausing long enough to dwell. I noticed my calendar no longer filled up with meetings that had no agenda. When they did, they included context. That was new. It was also earned. Late one afternoon, I walked past the lobby and noticed the badge printer running again. Visitors arriving for something unrelated to me. I didn't slow down. The sound had lost its meaning. On the drive home, traffic moved steadily. The radio played something familiar. The sky did what it always does when the day ends. There was no sense of triumph, no internal speech about standing my ground, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I hadn't bent where it would have been easier to fold. Revenge implies intent. I'd never had any. What I had was responsibility, and I treated it like the job it was. The consequences followed on their own schedule, without my supervision or approval. That's the part people misunderstand. You don't have to strike back for justice to arrive. You just have to leave a clean trail and stay where you are long enough for the system to trip over it. The meeting at 4 o'clock disappeared into a folder full of timestamps, and the 5 minutes after it became just another reference point in a process that didn't need a narrator. The work continued. I continued with it. And nothing about that felt unfinished.